Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are listening today. Thank you all for joining me today for the 8th of our Colombia lecture series on social justice and the AEC industry. I am Feniosky Peña-Mora, Executive Director of the Colombia Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space, and Armstrong Professor of Colombia's Full Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. As the events of the last months have demonstrated, including the election last week, we are living during exceedingly challenging times, characterized by divides, distrusts, and distancing. However far apart we have been, however far apart we currently are, we need to learn to come together, to be together, to act together for social, economic, and environmental justice. The faculty and staff of the Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space would like to add our voices to those decrying institutionalized racism in the AEC industry. Today, our industry has challenging work ahead to achieve true racial and gender inclusion. We need to stand with our architects, engineers, contractors, and suppliers from underrepresented and marginalized communities. We need to incorporate the lessons of diversity to build a better future for our industry, characterized by respect, opportunity, and collaboration. From mid-May to early September, our COVID-19 lecture series brought people together to address the impact, response, recovery, and preparedness of the architecture, engineering, and construction community in regard to the coronavirus pandemic. The 19 weekly lectures in the series can be seen on our website, cbips.engineering.colombia.edu. Today, as we continue our series on social justice and the AEC industry, I would like to thank the organizations with whom we are collaborating in presenting these lectures. They are the American Council of Engineering Companies, New York, the American Institute of Architects, New York chapter, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization, Engineering News Record, the National Academy of Construction, and NICOVA-NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects here in New York. From the lecture in September 22nd by Justin Garrett Moore to last week's talk by Pascal Sablan, our program on the AEC industry and social justice has focused on issues of activism, community participation, social inclusion, in engineering practice, needed change in the education of architects and engineers, and advocacy for racial justice in the architecture, engineering, and construction professions. Recording of the 7 lectures in this series are also on the CBIPS website. Today, we broaden our definition of inclusion to different issues of diversity. The co-moderator and respondent today is Harvey Molotch, Emeritus Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and Sociology at New York University. Prior to his appointment at NYU, he was Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics and Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Areas of research include urban development and political economy, the sociology of architecture, design, and consumption, environmental degradation, and the mechanism of interracial inequalities. He recently was part of an ongoing charrette on revamping the downtown of Santa Barbara, California, working with the local Untitled Chapter. His writings focus on critics and cities with special attention to economic development, urban security, artifacts, and product design. He's the author of several books, including Against Security, How We Go Wrong at Airports, Subways, and Other Sites of Ambiguous Danger, by Princeton University Press of 2012, Toilet, Public Restrooms and the Politics of Gender, edited with Laura Noren, by NYU Press of 2010. So thank you, Harvey, for being here with us today. And now the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me and making me part of this wonderfully impressive series. I'm so happy to be part of the program, in part because it includes, indeed features, my friend Joel Sanders. And Joel is, I'm sure, known to many here because he is a prominent figure not only in architecture through his practice across many fields and in various genres, but also as an intellectual who has made significant contributions to the issues of social and cultural analysis, and those in particular having to do with social justice. So he is an architect of many hats, including sometimes those that are very distinctive and intellectually daring. His background is education and teaching at Princeton, at Columbia, and currently his affiliation as a teaching faculty at Yale. His architectural practice has been based in New York, and he has, as part of his branching out as an intellectual practitioner, he has taken on such subjects as gender, masculinity. His book Stud, S-T-U-D, is a departure for any architect in terms of opening up agendas beyond the conventional focus of architecture and technology. He is continuing in that sort of pioneering work with the projects he has now taken on in terms of gender and public restrooms. He will speak more of that, including his project Mix, and he will take us right into the heart. I think that's something that Joel and I share, that when you talk about human beings and their needs and their practices in city life and urban existence, you are taken right into the public restroom in a very intimate and significant way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel, who will carry us forward.
Okay, thank you, Harvey, for that generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Hold on, everybody. Okay, is that working? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, it's working.
Good. Okay, good. So, thanks, first of all, this is like old home day. Thanks to Rick Bell, an old friend and colleague, for inviting me to participate in this timely lecture series. And as a graduate of Columbia College and GSAP, it was an offer I couldn't refuse. And also, again, it's an opportunity to reconnect with an admired friend and colleague, Harvey Molotch, who I met 10 years ago when he organized a conference about bathrooms that turned into, what is, I think, one of the most serious and most admired books that we constantly recommend and go to as a kind of source. So again, my name is Joel Sanders. I'm principal of JSA MIXdesign, professor at Yale. And I just want to start the presentation by telling you a little bit about my practice. I run, as Harvey mentioned, JSA MIXdesign. Mix is a branch of my New York-based design studio, and it's a full-service architectural studio. We specialize in doing work at universities, as well as art museums, and also to pay the bills, we do residential commissions like houses and multifamily housing. But again, in 2018, we established this new branch, Mix, and Mix is a think tank and a design consultancy, and we're dedicated to considering the needs of a broad segment of the population that we think that the discipline of architecture has traditionally overlooked. What we refer to as non-compliant bodies, people of different ages, genders, races, and abilities that fall out of the cultural mainstream. And since the 19th century, architects and designers, I would generalize from Vitruvius to Le Corbusier, have designed buildings based on the dimensions gathered from studying and from measuring the characteristics of the so-called normal body, one that is assumed to be white, able-bodied, cisgender, and male. And this ergonomic data has been the basis of design standards encoded in the architectural guidelines and regulatory codes that are still in use to this day. However, this supposedly objective, this supposedly scientific data has been used to differentiate quote unquote normal from abnormal bodies. At different moments in history, including our own, it's been used to justify discriminatory policies determining who has access to and who is excluded from public space. And that would include women, people of color, immigrants, and the disabled, to name a few, based on the erroneous assumption that they possess innate physical, mental, or moral defects that render them unfit to enter the public realm. And so MIX is dedicated to combating this legacy of exclusion in architecture. We work with progressive clients to apply an inclusive design approach to develop toolkits, recommendations, and prototypes for making everyday building types like campuses, museums, workplaces, and restrooms, which I'll be talking quite a bit about today, safe and accessible for a wide spectrum of people with different identities and embodiments. And our work is based on a series of design principles which we believe differentiate ourselves but build upon the important foundation of both universal design and the ADA. First, we cast a wider net, and unlike a lot of regulatory codes that tend to focus on people with physical disabilities, our intersectional approach is based on the conviction that human experience and embodied identities are constituted by a variety of interconnected factors, and they include age, gender, race, culture, religion, and ability. And again, we, like other of our esteemed colleagues, are trying to offer, to expand upon providing physical accommodations, like separate ADA ramps and entrances, which we believe potentially segregate and stigmatize those with special needs. And our goal is to generate opportunities to allow differently embodied and identified people to mix in public space, and so hence our name, MIXdesign. And so we have developed a two-step process represented in this diagram to foster sharing among individuals, families, friends, cohorts, and caregivers. And we begin step one with research analysis. We analyze the needs of a diverse list of end users listed on the left of this chart as they engage in a variety of activities. This chart is specific to restrooms, okay? And then we conduct a comparative analysis using surveys, interviews, literature reviews, and we began to look at what are the overlapping end user needs. And the outcome is a kind of matrix of shared design strategies that guide the column on the right, that guide design. They could be material and finish choices, strategies for wayfinding, lighting, specifications for furniture, as well as the kind of design of the overall ambiance or atmosphere of the space. And again, our goal is to allow the maximum number of differently embodied and identified people to interact in different settings, while also providing options for people with unique functional or privacy needs. And we recognize that there are different ways of being different that don't allow for one-size-fits-all solutions. And lastly, engagement. MIX believes, like many of our colleagues, that inclusive design depends on the active participation of stakeholders and end users who who can provide valuable insights from their lived experience of the designed environment. And we also pride ourselves on a cross-disciplinary approach. We have teams of experts representing race, gender, and disability, as well as policy, law, and building codes to enable us to conduct engagement practices that will allow us to generate innovative design concepts. So my talk is divided into two parts. Part one will illustrate how we're applying these principles I've shared with you into practice through STALD, our initiative towards public restrooms. And then during the second half, I'm going to conclude by looking at some recent work that we're doing that relates to pandemic design. Okay, so STALD was founded in 2015 in response to American controversies about transgender access to public restrooms. This is a kind of list of just the tip of the iceberg of some of our contributors. And I would say that when we began to look into this, particularly me and Susan Stryker, a noted and celebrated trans theorist and historian, we began to look at so much of the writing and news perspectives about this issue, but nobody really talked about this as a design issue. Okay, no one looked at the physical space. Okay, and also they tended to look at this as a functional issue. Okay, and we are trying to look at this in a cross-cultural way. So one of the first things that we did before coming up with design was we stepped back and we looked at restrooms in a cultural and historical context. And we quickly learned that restroom controversies are not new in America, that at different moments in our history, the public restroom has been a kind of crucible that has registered social anxieties triggered by the threat of a series of marginalized groups entering into mainstream society. And some historical milestones include debates sparked by the introduction of the separate ladies' room, which appeared in the 1880s to accommodate women first entering the workplace. The fight to abolish colored bathrooms during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And the fear of contamination by gay men for sharing public lavatories with straight men during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 90s. And finally, the pressure exerted by the disability rights movement, a coalition formed by grassroots activists that led to the passing of the ADA in 1990, the 30th anniversary that we're celebrating this year. And in each instance, the public restroom, by virtue of it being physical space, transforms an abstract concern into a tangible peril. It becomes and has and continues to become a setting for these erroneous fantasies of the so-called normal citizen being compelled to physically interact with others in a public space. And I'm going to move in. And also what we think is so threatening to people about, or what adds another component to this, is that we think trans people, not trans and non-binary people, sort of call into question the kind of binary foundation of our culture, which really believes that there are two genders, male and female, that can be kind of spatialized and separated in conventional restrooms. So over the past 4 years, STALD has developed guidelines and prototypes that attempt to go further than the generally accepted code compliant solution for all gender restrooms, illustrated here, referred to often as a single user's solution that supplements the traditional segregated facility by adding a single occupancy room, often with wheelchair access, and sort of relabeled as gender neutral or something to that effect. And this is a good step in the right direction. However, research shows that it stigmatizes non-normative bodies, not only trans and non-binary people, but also disabled people. Why? By isolating them in one room and preventing them from mixing with others in public space. So instead, we favor the multi-user facility and illustrated here, we worked with Gallaudet University, a school for the deaf, to develop a prototype that I'll illustrate here. So let me share this with you. Hold on, this video. Okay, so as you can see here, we begin with segregated restrooms back to back. We first eliminate the plumbing stack wall, treating the restroom as one open space. We eliminate the corridor wall, and now the bathroom becomes a porous extension of the corridor. We add blocks of differently sized standard ambulatory and ADA stalls, full privacy, and caregiving rooms with 3 fixtures. And then we add communal grooming and washing areas off the circulation path. And then we add a lounge area that activates the corridor into an animated social space. And we are in the process of building those restrooms that have become a kind of model that we share with others. And we also have worked with Gallaudet for addressing a related issue at their sports facility, which are locker rooms. And so we built a single user facility that facilitates not only places to shower and wash for trans people, but also space for childcare, breastfeeding, dry counters for medical injections, showers for exercises, and also a hand shower for Muslim bathroom ablutions. And in addition, we developed a speculative prototype for a high traffic airport concourse, which we treat as an open agora-like precinct adjacent to the main concourse that is animated, as you can see in this aerial view, into 3 parallel activity zones dedicated respectively to grooming adjacent to the concourse at the bottom of the screen, washing and eliminating. And very quickly, the grooming station is immediately adjacent again to the concourse. There's a multi-level counter placed against a mirrored wall that allows people of different statures and abilities to groom, reflected against the backdrop of moving passengers. And those who want privacy can retreat into these curtained alcoves for breastfeeding, administering medical procedures, or engaging in meditation and prayer, which studies have shown are some of the activities that people conduct in restrooms. This is an image and a cross-section through the washing station designed to meet the needs of a multiplicity of people, adults, children, and people in wheelchairs, to name a few. And their motion detectors activate faucets inset into this water wall that allows water to flow down an inclined splash plane, placed at different ergonomic heights, that's then collected and cleaned in a remediating planter before being recycled. And finally, at the back of the facility is the station with consolidates rows of fully enclosed stalls that offer acoustic and visual privacy. And one of the things we quickly learned early in the process is that innovative design is not enough. And we realized that making the multi-user type, which we champion, meant amending the International Plumbing Code, the IPC, which is the model code that governs most construction in the US. And so we joined forces with the AIA and the National Center for Transgender Equality, and we were successful. And I'm happy to say that the 2021 version of the IPC will now make all gender multi-user restrooms code compliant. In 2017, we released Stalled Online, and it's an open source website designed to share our research with a broad audience. And I'm also proud to say we've had thousands and thousands and thousands of international visitors. But our work isn't complete. We continue to expand and refine this project to take into consideration some of the feedback that we've received from MIX's two sectors that we work with. We work a lot with universities and often now with art museums and art galleries, including we're doing a study now with the Queen's Museum and also been working at the Yale University Art Gallery. In addition, we're getting feedback from our collaborators at Yale Public Health that's added a new dimension to our work, that equal access to public restrooms is not only a civil right, but evidence-based research shows that the design environment has a direct and tangible impact on physical and mental health. And so working in collaboration with students and faculty, including one amazing student, Antonia Caba, who's no longer a student, is now doing her PhD. She conducted a great deal of research, okay, that allowed us to expand the matrix of end users whose needs we need to think about in the restroom. But then something else happened, which was COVID. Okay, and so I just want to end this presentation by talking maybe for 10 or 15 minutes about how we're collaborating with experts from Yale Public Health, but also the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, also in Philadelphia, to generate space planning principles that would address what I think many of us think is the inevitable impact of the pandemic on the future of public buildings. And, you know, first, coming up with quick temporary solutions is important, but we are taking a longer view and trying to make sure that we take into account the needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations who are often left out of the conversation. We must be vigilant and not repeat historical mistakes, as I've already shown you over the course of American history. Public health fears were used to justify the oppression and spatial segregation, again, of non-compliant bodies, especially African Americans, as well as queer, trans, and folks with disabilities. And so again, this is obvious, but public health and inclusive design are not either or propositions, but both and opportunities. And moving forward, we must make sure that clients, governments, dedicate the resources we need to come up with solutions that meet the needs of everyone, including non-marginalized populations that are often, again, overlooked. So we're in the process now of developing design principles that address what we think is one of the fundamental challenges posed by COVID. That is balancing the need for individuals to engage with one another, which human connectivity, and with the built environment, which is now advising people to have less and less physical contact with other individuals and from touching the potentially contaminating surfaces of the built environment, right? In other words, how do you balance human connectivity with social distancing? And many others, I won't even talk about this, are coming up with, you know, new lexicons of sanitary materials and fixtures. Other colleagues of mine, including actually a mutual friend of Harvey and I, Mark Sarmaki and his crew at LTL, Louis Sarmaki-Lewitz, have come up with a manual of physical distancing, which is incredible. They've kind of visualized the quantitative data and recommendations of medicine and science. But we're taking a complementary approach by looking at it more from a qualitative perspective, by looking at what we call environmental stressors that pose unintentional risks of infection. And in short, we believe for people to feel safe but connected, they need public spaces designed to minimize environmental stressors introduced by disorienting spaces or overstimulation, okay, too much noise, light, and crowds. And so what we have been thinking about are that reducing environmental stressors depends on spatial awareness that take the form of what we call sensory cues that make people aware of the presence of themselves and the activities of others, especially in public unfamiliar spaces. So now with the spread of the virus, all of us have to some extent become non-compliant bodies, hyper-aware and often anxious about how to maneuver within once familiar but now disabling spaces. And so what we're trying to do is learn from non-compliant bodies. And we're doing so by drawing from the expertise of three MIXdesign collaborators who have been looking, who are experts about and looking at three marginalized communities: people in wheelchairs, deaf users, and people on the autism spectrum. And we believe, or it's the working hypothesis, this is a work in progress, that we believe that we can learn from these groups who've developed novel behavioral and design strategies for fostering spatial awareness, and that those could be applied to making spaces healthier and increase a sense of belonging, health, and well-being during this challenging times that we are living in. These are the three team members. One is Humil Arroyo, who's a mobility and universal design expert, as well as the former disability specialist at the New York State Department of Transportation, and also identifies as non-binary and also uses a motorized wheelchair. Hansel Baumann, who established the Deaf Space Project at Gallaudet University in 2006 to explore architecture's role in deaf experience. And Magda Mostafa, an autism expert based in Cairo, who authored the Autism Aspects Index. And basically, we're working again together to see what lessons can we learn from these communities that could be applied to the general public. And I don't have much time, but I just want to show you, I mean, this is just a chart of how we work, where we begin to look at different activities, circulation, transition, welcome, lounge, look at the way different design interventions or modes of behavior that have been implemented by these different user groups. And then this matrix allows us to put together a kind of comparative analysis and then sort of step back and say, what if any of these approaches are common not only to these three user groups, as well as others that we're studying. I'm just limiting it here for the exercise, that could be applied to COVID. So I'm just going to quickly end in the next 4 or 5 minutes by showing you how we're applying this work to a project that we're doing that's basically a comparative analysis of building entry sequences. We're looking at public buildings, we're looking at hospitals, college campuses, and museums, again, I mentioned before. Okay, so this is some studies that we're doing for a project we're doing right now at Princeton University for a ground up a new residential college. It's a very initial hypothetical kind of entry sequence in the college, and it's based on what we're calling multi-sensory wayfinding. It augments conventional signage and uses color, materials, lighting, and acoustics to differentiate two kinds of legible activity zones: barrier-free circulation paths that are in white in these diagrams, and what we call media microclimates, sort of spaces that are demarcated that balance social distancing and human connectivity in a way that we hope would minimize environmental stressors. So let me walk you through the scheme. This is the entry in the vestibule. Visitors can clean at hand sanitizing stations before entering the building. There's a centralized planter with separate entry, circulation, and separate entry and exit aisles to prevent unwanted collisions. And what's very important again is number 2 and 3, which are these transitional thresholds that research from deaf space, people in wheelchairs and people on the autism spectrum, that it's essential for these populations, but for all of us to be able to stop, have a calm down, have a space of transition, and begin to kind of get the lay of the land before we navigate into unfamiliar interior environments. Then what we're kind of, this is a version of STAL 2.0 based on our expanded research. It takes into account the needs of more people. And as you can see to the left and right, there are caregiving rooms with 3 fixtures, particularly that we've learned for, again, for people of different religions, Orthodox Jews, Muslims. We learned also that, you know, prayer is extremely important. Breastfeeding and a whole host of issues that relate to women's needs, including menstruation, that would include also trans men, and so forth and so on. And also something, you know, to the effect that we're recommending that there's so many people now commuting and exercising to work, that there should be provisions for everyone to begin to change clothes and also to clean up. So in other words, the bathroom is no longer down an unmarked hallway, but it's front and center immediately behind this inclusive reception desk with a counter at different heights and signage not illustrated here, and monitors that would provide multilingual information as well as American Sign Language. And this is a parallel section taken through the same, let's say, resolution college entry. It's an adjacent study lounge, again, differentiated, as you can see here, into these different multisensory zones. I'll quickly talk to you on the left is what we call the COM zone, and it's based upon the input we receive from studying, again, people on the autism spectrum. It enables people to have small group conversations in these semi-enclosed sound absorptive nooks where there's a low level of lighting and acoustical treatment to limit unwanted overstimulation, as well as high back seating, not white, but a complementary color to the silhouette of signing bodies for American Sign Language, okay? And so again, and as well to the right, you can see that barrier-free zone that allows pairs of wheelchair users or deaf signers to begin to navigate public space in a differentiated lane, okay? And we'd like to think again that these kinds of ideas would be good for all of us, okay? Not just these populations. And lastly, this is a cross-section through a kind of indoor-outdoor transition zone. Again, media microclimates are defined by these sound-absorbing oval carpets, as well as these suspended sound cones that absorb sound and emit pools of glare-free light. And seating, if you look to the right of the image, deaf space shows us that not only deaf people, but many people of different heights and statures would like movable mobile furniture at different heights that would allow people to engage with one another, as well as with iPhones and laptops. So just to conclude, this study is a work in progress, again, embracing our conviction that we have no choice but to see COVID-19 as an opportunity to make the built environment more inclusive and better meet the needs of different populations. And also, what kind of our mantra, and we hope this work begins to demonstrate this, that looking at the world through the lens of non-compliant bodies promises to be a catalyst for creativity that could yield to the production of safe, accessible, and hygienic spaces for all of us. And as Magda Mustafa says, when you design for the margins, you can come up with designs that benefit all. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop share, and let's have a conversation.
That would be just, that would be great, Joel, because you have given us a great basis, I think, for conversation. While people are gathering their thoughts, because we're going to end up with participation from numbers of people, but I just give a quick or a first reaction. And that is, although I've been following Joel's work over the years, I think that it has come to a kind of, I won't call it a conclusion, but has brought us to a very common spot where commonality is what it's all about. And the inclusion, I think of this work as not just dealing with inclusion and the need for there to be inclusion. It seems to me to be a laboratory of inclusion. And so that it isn't just that because of changing attitudes and norms and laws, facilities need to be more inclusionary. I think that this sets up a model for what inclusion might be across the spheres by approaching it in the most radical sort of venue where separation has been historically the most practiced and severe. If you can make it here, if you can make inclusion happen here, you can make inclusion happen anywhere. And when we take up all of these realms of odor and sound and social stigma and gender and all the rest of it, those are the same issues of separation and anxiety that are on the battlefields, wherever human tensions and destruction occurs. So I think that this goes well beyond the toilet, Joel, in a very profound way.
Harvey, Harvey, can you turn on your video? I think during the Joel's presentation, we turn it off so that we can see you. Sorry, Joel, that I interrupted. Please.
No, I was just going to say, I love that line that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. I'm going to have Frank Sinatra now in the background and in the future.
Okay, good. So, Feniosky, do you want to, or Joel, do you want to respond beyond?
To what you said, no.
The Frank Sinatra.
Yes, no, but I love that. I think.
Well, I think I just want to follow up on what Harvey just mentioned. I think you alluded to, particularly when you contextualize your work with COVID-19 and how it has highlighted some of the things that we already were seeing, but it kind of brought it to the front and center of us. And I really like how you went over and just went from the private space of like the stall to the public space of larger area where there is a transportation hubs, you know, your airport example. And there is a question that is coming up, which I would like to elaborate a little bit because I thought it was quite interesting, is looking at the notion from Jasmine Tepel of the issue of kind of when you have individuals in which English is not their native language or they do not know the language well, you know, how do you look at the issue of wayfinding and communication so that people feel welcome and feel that this space is their space as well. They don't feel excluded. And when you look at the notion of intersectionality and multiple identities, which you alluded to with even the individuals that you're collaborating in this recent work. So if both Harvey and you can talk a little bit about those issues in which now language becomes another layer and how we can convey information in ways that are easily straightforward and almost intuitive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say, I mean, I think that you rather than comment, I think you perfectly encapsulated, you know, some of the main principles of what we're trying to achieve. You know, first, that COVID really only highlights and exacerbates what have been already longstanding issues. And I would say that, you know, as we work with clients, you know, I think a question that we're all facing, to what extent in new construction do we design for COVID, right? Or what do we do forward? And, you know, our attitude is that not to be COVID specific, but, you know, already, even before this, not only was inclusion and diversity important, but also health and well-being, right, in our society. So I just think that we all need to think about a new level of standards that promote health, hygiene, safety, inclusion, and well-being. And I think also, as you said, intersectionality is the key issue, that we're looking horizontally, you know, across different end user communities, but hopefully that we're not being reductive and stereotyping. And I think that's something that we really grapple with all the time. And then the last issue I think that you raised about language, okay, that while, you know, we have been doing research, and in fact, we are working on a project with collaborators to come up with new signage for restrooms, for example. Language is important, and we need multilingual signage. But what we're looking for, as I mentioned, intuitive, what we call multisensory wayfinding, that relies not only on language, but on, you know, cues embedded in the physical environment that would allow people to navigate space.
Thank you.
So, you know, one of the things that this reminds me of is at a still different level is there's a book by Gunnar Myrdal, who's known, that name is known to many people because he wrote about democracy in the United States, and he wrote about race in the late 1940s and 1950s, a very celebrated Swedish sociologist, economist. And but he wrote a book called Beyond the Welfare State. Mm-hmm. And the idea of beyond the welfare state is that when you're trying to help people in conventional welfare, which he was talking about, the trick is to do it in a way that interferes least in their lives. so that giving also, there's an art to providing, and that is to minimize interference and not call attention to the fact that you're making a grant, for example, to someone. And again, this realm of the public facility that Joel and his colleagues are working on, I sense that in the designs, is that there's a phrase I like very much, which is default to decency. That is that it just becomes pervasively decent without that decency itself being called on or featured in the manner of signage, for example, or anything else. And also ventilation, which does this massive service to people without any physical intervention or legalistic or moralistic intervention. What have you got to say about ventilation, Joel?
Well, you know, a couple of things. Before I talk about ventilation, which is not my specialty, well, on that note, you know, so many, you know, the CDC and the AIA have come up with a whole set of metrics that, you know, speak very specifically about the need for ventilation. And that both mechanical, but really, you know, sort of natural ventilation, and others are better equipped than I to speak to that. You know, where, but something you did touch on, two things. One is that the Swedish, we recently, we just finished that, or a few years ago, we reinstalled the National Museum at Stockholm. And so I would go to Sweden all the time, and as well as Scandinavia. And first of all, you know better than I mean, they, first of all, in the 60s, you know, America, Britain, but it was really the Nordic countries that really, you know, kind of invented universal design. And they continue to put us to shame. So for example, the installed restrooms that some think are so radical. There's a new library I visited in Helsinki, a national library, okay, that has, you know, this restroom already there, or kind of a version like that. So there's a lot to learn from them. We should be embarrassed by them is what I'm really saying. But also I think it gets back to this idea of intuitive, that our hope is that these interventions will be almost invisible, okay? That they, you know, again, it's not like you do this and to mandate and regulate in a Foucauldian kind of way, but they should just be kind of, kind of quiet interventions in the built environment. And then the last thing that I was thinking of was sort of strategy that you were sort of saying, Harvey, yeah, again, to be more subtle, right? That what we found when we engage in workshops, like we've done quite a few university workshops, you know, giving counsel upon public restrooms and what they should do. And one particularly memorable one was at the University of Utah, in which the chief architect who had hosted this 60 people from all across the university said, "I'm a little concerned." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, I would say like at least half, if not more, of the audience are Mormon, and they're not going to be very, you know, sympathetic." This was a few years ago with, you know, this trans thing. And I said, "Don't worry about it." And I think what I'm really getting at is that I think by talking intersectionally, and I think by asking everyone in the room, right, to say that if you live long enough, I mean, all of us are already non-compliant bodies. I have a pre-existing lung condition, or, you know, all of us have some kind of issue, or if we live long enough, we'll become to some extent disabled, okay? And I think once you turn the conversation and allow people to look in the mirror and see that they're gonna benefit from these interventions, I think that really is the way forward.
Thank you, Joel. It's quite interesting because your last point kind of goes to the comment that Miriam Fisher is bringing up in terms of you know, the issue of access and how, for example, if you look at elevators to subway stations and how that not only benefit individuals with disability but also like individuals carrying a stroller and how to move. And so the question is that COVID has brought, as you mentioned, this issue to the forefront, but also it has put a significant strain on the finances. And like, for example, here in New York, the NTA had a big capital program in which they were planning to upgrade some of the areas in terms of access, elevators, and how do you see that, in time of stress, people start cutting, reducing budget? How do you see individuals in decision-making positions in weighing in this issue of universal design that you so eloquently address, and the financial realities, and ensuring that they make the best decision possible? What do you speak to that? And also, Harvey, your thoughts on that would be great because of your work in Santa Barbara and looking how cities make those decisions on being as inclusive as possible.
Yeah. Henry, do you want to talk about that, or what do you think? Or I'm happy to.
No, Joe, go
okay.
to it.
Well, I know I just say this again. I think your question is really the statement that I just want to reinforce. And that's the point. You know what's interesting? As I was giving this talk, and I've admittedly given versions of this before, it was early on in the pandemic, and I already see how things have changed. Because when I first showed those slides about those makeshift solutions, that's what everyone was doing, urgently. And we were getting calls all the time, and including calls from newspapers like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? What do you recommend? And we would say, stop, okay? And the first thing we said was just that what we were seeing, and I'll give you an example. There was a major foundation that we were talking to, and we called them, and we just learned a few days later, or shortly into the pandemic, that they had discontinued this inclusive design initiative because they were shifting to their priority to pandemic. So that's what I mean. It's I think it used to be seen more as an either-or proposition. To be more optimistic, I think, and it's really Black Lives Matter that brought to the attention that who is being disproportionately affected, right? Black and brown populations, right? Who are statistically suffer, the most vulnerable populations and suffer from disabilities. So I think that either or is beginning to shift, and people, I think, recognize that we have to be looking at them together. But in answer to your questions, we have to be vigilant and not shift money from one thing to the other, but see that they're one initiative. Yeah.
So I just would comment slightly. I'm a sociologist, and a lot of people would ask me, how come you're interested in issues like, for example, design? And one of the reasons is that sociology is heavily involved in studying problems, and they are social problems and political problems, and they don't get solved. I mean, they're just horrible. And then I met an industrial designer, and he showed me his new design for a can opener, and it was terrific. And so here, this is a realm in which there can be a solution. And that's why I get back to the idea of the restroom as the social laboratory for the world, is that it makes it approachable, and it's physical, it's engineering, and it's cultural, and it's political. And inclusion, and this topic, which we now see everywhere, it wafts to all settings and sites, but this really is the best place to give us a model for how it's the can opener to solving this great problem.
Right, but I would just amplify your comment, Harvey, by saying that to me it's about the marriage of our two disciplines, design, not just our two disciplines in sociology. But it's, I think what's essential that, well, let me say, when I talk to fellow designers, I say that we can't do this alone. And that the problem in the past is that we've looked at it through this Howard Roark narrative heroic lens and really believe that we can change the world through architecture. You can't. And it's really, about forming these cross-disciplinary collaborations, gathering different perspectives, and then coming up with solutions. So for example, Stalled, right, is a design solution that came out of the input of so many people from other disciplines and can only be enacted by changing policy and law. Okay, so I think that that's really important, that people see that it's a marriage moving forward. It's not one or the other.
And we have our colleague, Julia Kausi. She's the director of the Finnish Architecture Museum. And she has a question, as you mentioned, both Joel and Harvey, with respect to kind of resources and, how much could be done now in times of COVID when institutions have very little resources and need to respond quickly. I think you alluded to, Joel, when you were mentioned at the beginning, when the pandemic was just starting, people were scrambling on doing something. But now if you were to look the lessons learned through these 7 months, and what will be the recommendations to organizations that want to do the right thing, but resources are quite limited and they need to be kind of agile on continue, particularly as we prepare for the second and the third wave of COVID, even though we have some hope there with the vaccine, but still it's going to take time in order to get it.
Okay, well, I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question, but I would say that what we're trying to do at least is work with clients to apply, let's say, what we're calling inclusive design practices and methodologies, but adapt them and make them specific to their problem at hand, okay, which is to ask them to think about who is their constituency, who is their audience. We don't have the time, effort, and resources to solve everyone's needs. We'd like to, but again, who are your end users, okay? And then let's analyze your space, your budget, your schedule, and figure out what would be relevant for you. So for example, 2 projects we're working on, we got a grant, an IMLS grant, to continue a pilot study we're doing with Queens Museum, okay? Don't have much money, but an incredible community resource. And before COVID, they came to us and said that they have this wonderfully, not that long ago, designed kind of atrium, okay? But it's very inhospitable. Its acoustics are bad. There's no place to sit. There's school groups that come and they have an audience of people of non-English speakers, particularly sort of South Asian communities and Black and Brown communities. So in other words, what we've done with them and are continuing to do, we have 2 years, is a series of workshops with stakeholders in the museum, but as well as with community groups. And what we systematically are trying to do is figure out what are the needs. And then we're coming up with a menu of solutions. We've already begun that. And they're not necessarily that expensive. Most of them are really about introducing acoustical materials, mobile furniture, new kinds of signage, new kinds of desks, new kinds of lounge areas, new kinds of respite areas for people on the autism spectrum that are really just trying to adapt what they already have, don't necessarily cost that much. And then I'll shut up. But then we're also now doing this exciting project I mentioned with Princeton University. It's a major ground up facility. We're working with teams of people, okay? And we have, a relatively, good budget to do this and time, not an endless budget, okay? But again, it's a process. It's a very slow, methodical process to work, to tailor make. In other words, I would say to allow the client, in this case, Princeton, with our guidance, for them to develop an end user engagement strategy and methodology that will allow them to get end user feedback, to set principles and ultimately come up with guidelines and design solutions that would be right for them. Okay, so I don't know if that makes sense. So I think it's about client, space, site-specific approaches.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. We could go on and on and on talking to you, Joel and Harvey, for in this topic. You have done incredible work. Just before we were talking about COVID, before we were talking, the social justice movement that we see today, you were there at the forefront, and some people would call it the bleeding edge. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your ideas. We really appreciate it. We also would like to thank a collaborating organization, ACEC New York, AIA New York, ASCE, CSU, ENR, NAC, and NICOVA NOMA. I also would like to thank all the industry leaders and the past speakers and co-moderators for both series who are here today. Wayne Crew, the General Secretary of the National Academy of Construction. Thank you, Wayne, for being so supportive. Mohammad Sadiq, the Chief Engineer, Office of the Queen's Board of President. Yves Michel, Project Executive and Chief Architect at MTA Construction and Development. Jorge Vanegas, the Dean of Architecture at Texas A&M University, who's going to be our co-moderator next week for our series finale with Commissioner Calise. And from Helsinki, Julia Kalsi, the former director of the Finnish Architectural Museum. I also would like to give a special thanks to all of you in their offices, agencies, and at home throughout New York City and around the world for taking time to listen today and bringing your questions and your commentaries. Continuing education for architects have been requested. If you are seeking those, please send your name by email to cvips@columbia.edu. And I also would like to thank my colleagues here at Columbia. I can tell you that none of this would have been possible without their help, their support. They are the Wizards of Oz behind the scenes, making sure that everything runs flawlessly. I would like to thank David Chitanava, Michael Smith, and Rick Bell, as well as John Park from our sister institution, Teachers College, for helping us. I also would like to encourage you to attend our kind of series finale. Our speaker next week on Tuesday, November 17, the final lecture in the series is going to be Commissioner Victor Calise of the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, and the co-moderator will be Jorge Vanegas, the Dean of Architecture at Texas A&M. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Harvey, for being here. Thank you so much for your insights and your comments. We really appreciate it. So have a wonderful afternoon, wonderful evening for everybody, and wonderful morning for everybody out there. Thank you, Joel. Thank you,
Thank
Harvey.
you very much. Great seeing you, Harvey.
Thank you, Joel.
Okay.
Great to be
Bye.
here. Bye-bye.